From previous lectures, we know that Ukraine was at the epicenter of the war between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. By 1941, its entire territory had fallen under the occupation of German, Romanian, and Hungarian forces. Millions of local residents died on the battlefield. The Ukrainian population suffered enormous losses under German occupation. We've already discussed the total extermination of Jews. Today, we'll turn our attention to Soviet prisoners of war, civilian hostages, and forced laborers, examining Germany's colonial policy toward Ukraine's non-Jewish population. Before invading the Soviet Union, Nazi leadership was not planning to use Soviet labor in Germany. They viewed Ukrainians and other Eastern Europeans as subhumans who carried a hostile communist ideology. These people were meant to either perish or become slaves to German colonists. This brutal colonization plan for Nazi-controlled territories was called the General Plan Ost. It envisaged mass extermination or enslavement of Slavic peoples, with their lands to be colonized by Germans. However, the Blitzkrieg failed. Instead of a swift victory, the Nazis ran into serious trouble at the front. This forced Adolf Hitler to revise his plans. Now, with resources running scarce, he permitted the use of Soviet workers for Reich's needs. Initially, Nazi leaders and industrialists focused on the multi-million army of Soviet prisoners of war. Soviet prisoners of war became one of the largest victim groups of Nazi occupation during the Second World War. Over 5 million Red Army soldiers were captured on the Soviet-German front, with more than 57% dying from hunger, disease, and exhausting labor in Nazi camps. Germany grossly violated international rules for treating prisoners, viewing the war not just as a military conflict but as a racial and ideological one. This view determined the treatment of Soviet military personnel. Political officers and Jews were often killed immediately, while most Red Army soldiers died not from executions but from hunger and harsh camp conditions. In 1941 and 1942, endless columns of exhausted soldiers became a common sight in occupied territories, particularly in Ukrainian towns and villages. Camp conditions were unbearable. Prisoners often lived in the open air, suffering from hunger, cold, infectious diseases, and hard labor. There were tragic instances of cannibalism among Soviet prisoners of war, reflecting their desperation. Nazi Germany traditionally continued calling the Soviet Union Russia, and Soviet prisoners Russians. In the Nazi hierarchy of prisoners of war, captured Russians occupied the lowest rank. The Nazis conducted the so-called sorting of Red Army prisoners, selecting those undesirable for ethnic or political reasons, such as political commissars, communists, and Jews. They were typically executed immediately. Others were promised certain preferences in exchange for cooperation with the Nazis. For a time, they even released ethnic Germans, Balts, Belarusians, and Ukrainians from captivity. By late 1941, after this sorting, about 270,000 Red Army soldiers were released from captivity, mainly Ukrainians freed in Ukraine. Among other cases was Crimean Tatar Nuri Khaliov, who was freed with help from the Muslim Committee. However, he wasn't granted complete freedom. He was forced to work in a German military unit before eventually escaping to Soviet partisans. Overall, 3.5 million Soviet prisoners of war died in captivity. So few managed to survive through official release. All released prisoners were later sent to work in Germany. Hitler had planned a lightning war with the quick defeat of the Soviet Union, after which German workers would return to factory work. The Nazis saw great danger in using Soviet labor, believing these people were infected with Bolshevism. So initially, they used Soviet prisoners of war only in prisoner of war camps, Wehrmacht units, and industrial enterprises. By late 1941, circumstances changed, forcing Nazi leadership to reconsider their stance on using the labor of Soviet prisoners of war. They agreed to employ them in Reich enterprises, particularly mines and metallurgical plants requiring substantial manpower. Yet by this time, most prisoners had already perished from disease, hunger, or exhaustion from hard labor. Facing an enormous labor shortage, the Nazis began deporting civilians from occupied territories for forced labor in Germany. Nazi policy of forced labor and workforce deportation from Ukrainian territories had clear colonial characteristics. All adult residents of occupied Ukrainian territories were forced to work for Germans. In January 1942, posters calling Ukrainians to work in Germany were issued, but the flow of volunteers quickly decreased. By the spring of 1942, worker deportation was carried out through a system of promises, social pressure, and terror. By the end of Nazi occupation, over 2 million Ukrainian residents were deported to the Reich, where they worked under forced labor conditions in factories, farms, and other sectors. From the summer of 1943, deportees included residents of so-called partisan villages. The Nazis suspected these villages of helping Soviet partisans and carried out mass reprisals. They would kill the inhabitants and then completely burn the villages. Over 300 such villages were destroyed in Ukraine. The most notorious case was Koryukivka in Chernihiv region, where about 7,000 people died. This number exceeds casualties in other known tragedies such as Khatyn in Belarus, Chechlidica, and French Oradour. One of many tragic examples is the residents of burned village Yevmivka, who were sent to labor camps near Munich. You can see the photos of children wearing Ost badges and working in factories alongside adults. These images remind us of the ruthless repression and forced labor endured by residents of burned Ukrainian villages. Ost, meaning Ostarbeiter, or Eastern worker in German, was the Nazi term for forced laborers deported to Germany from Soviet territories, particularly Ukraine. They were often called Russian or Soviet workers. Ostarbeiters endured the worst conditions: special supervised camps, isolation from Germans and other foreigners at work, lowest wages, and poor nutrition. They occupied the lowest position in the foreign worker hierarchy. Only Soviet prisoners of war and Jews faced worse conditions. Official data shows about 13.5 million civilians and military personnel worked forcibly in Germany during the Second World War. This was the largest use of forced labor since slavery. Ukrainian Ostarbeiters' survival chances largely depended on their placement. State production facilities had the harshest conditions, while agricultural work offered better food access. A third of Ostarbeiters worked in agriculture, while half worked in industry. Over half were young people and minors. Soviet prisoners of war and Ostarbeiters faced concentration camp imprisonment for the slightest disobedience. Escapes and industrial sabotage were the most common forms of resistance. We have already told the dramatic stories of Anastasia Gulay and Ihor Malitsky, whose relatives were repressed in the 1930s. In 1943, they were deported to work in Germany. Ihor Malitsky escaped from a train in Czech territory en route to Germany. After several months, Anastasia Gulay fled her camp for Ostarbeiters, reaching the Sun River, where Polish gendarmes caught her and her companions. Both Anastasia and Ihor ended up in Auschwitz concentration camp, but documents registered them as civilian Russians. Following Nazi logic, since Ukraine didn't exist as a state, Ukrainians were considered Russians. Official German documents registered millions of Ukrainian concentration camp prisoners and Ostarbeiters as Russians or Poles. This colonial view of Ukrainians partially persists today, with Russia and Russians often considered the main victims of Nazi crimes, rather than Ukrainians or Belarusians whose territories were under Nazi occupation. Ukrainian mass graves in prisoner cemeteries, which Germany calls Russian cemeteries, are also often ignored. The war's end freed Eastern workers and prisoners of war from Nazi slavery, but didn't grant them true freedom. In the Soviet Union, surrender and forced labor for the enemy were considered desertion and treason. After returning home, Red Army soldiers and civilians had to undergo political screening by Soviet security services. After the screening, over 20% were sent to Gulag camps or labor battalions. This was typical Soviet colonial practice, forcing people to work, rebuilding the war economy for future struggle for world domination. Less than half of repatriates could immediately return home, where they faced the stigma of traitor. Anastasia Goulet recalled that initially schoolchildren refused to sit with her at the same desk. Only in 1956 were the first steps taken to change attitudes towards former prisoners of war. Their rehabilitation and proper commemoration began only after the Soviet Union's collapse.